In this game, played in Riga, Latvia in 1954, the great Mikhail Tal uses a single pawn to completely lock down and paralyze his opponent's position. When his opponent, Vladimir Saigan, does what he can to sort of unravel and escape the bind that he is in, Tal finds another tactical motif to keep him locked down. Let's enjoy this beautiful game. Tal has the black pieces, Vladimir Saigan has white. Let us jump right in. D4 is played by Saigan. Knight F6 from Tal, C4 and C5. Tal is inviting a modern Benoni, a very sharp opening, the kind of opening he's very happy with. White wants to avoid that, so he does not gain the space with D5, but instead plays knight to F3, this move D5 being the main move. Knight to F3, Tal is not going to take on D4, but instead plays E6, inviting White to go ahead and play D5 and get that modern Benoni structure. White plays G3. He wants to keep the center fluid because he knows if it gets into a modern Benoni position, he could be in some trouble, so he avoids that with Tal. Now Tal does go ahead and take on D4. Knight D4 and D5 gets his space in the center, and bishop to G2. So White seems to have a pretty good position, but Tal says White didn't grab the space when they had the opportunity, so I'll grab the space. So he plays D4 immediately, kicking the knight out of its position, knight to F3 and D4. So it is Tal, in fact, who has the nice space advantage. Now, it may look like this pawn at E5 is hanging, but if the knight takes, then just queen to A5 check with a double attack on the king and the knight. So that pawn is not in any jeopardy. White goes ahead and castles. Now the pawn can be taken, but just play knight to C6 and you're fine. And E3. Trying to work on this space advantage that black has, trying to undermine it and weaken it. Tal just plays bishop to E7, no problem. Pawn takes, knight B2, and bishop to E6. So all of black's minor pieces are developed on good squares. White's not quite developed his queen side yet. But the main strategic issue is this pawn right here, the one on D4. It's isolated, so it could become a target, but at the same time it is passed and could become a great strength. Watch how Tal makes it a great strength. Rook to E1, castles, and B3. The idea of bishop to B2 and attacking that pawn. Queen to D7, bishop to B2, rook A to D8, just centralizing and adding another defender to the pawn. Now A3. White would love to play B4 and maybe even B5 and dislodge this knight that protects the pawn. So Tal plays A5 to make sure that cannot be played. But now knight to E5, a good move from White. He wants to trade off this C6 knight, which is defending the pawn, and open up the long diagonal for his light squared bishop. Knight takes, rook takes, and now B6, just to get the pawn away from the gaze of the bishop at G2. And knight to F3. So we see White trying to encircle this pawn and capture it and prove that it is a weakness. The queen, the knight, and the bishop all are attacking the pawn at the moment. So Tal is defending it twice, so he plays bishop to C5, adding a third defender to the pawn. White plays queen to D2. Now this is a sneaky move. Not only does it allow a rook to come in and add another attacker, but he's also threatening now to play B4 because the queen supports that square. So Tal has to do something about that threat. He can't just let that happen. Otherwise, he'll lose the pawn and be much worse. So he plays knight to G4, gaining a tempo against the rook, but he has another idea here also, which you'll see in a second. Rook E to E1, and notice this knight is aiming at the F2 square. This bishop is aiming at the square, but this pawn is in the way. So he advances the pawn and is now threatening. Bishop takes F2 check, which would win a pawn and an exchange. So the rook goes back to F1 to defend that pawn. He doesn't want to take the pawn now because he doesn't want to exchange two active pieces for a passive rook at F1, but the pressure still remains. Queen to D6. So now he plays this to prevent this B4 push. He was preventing it with tactics before. Now he's preventing it directly with the queen move to D6. So the best move from White here very hard to find is probably bishop to c3. And here he is aiming to play b4. The reason you wouldn't want to play a move like that is because the a3 pawn hangs. But after bishop takes a3, h3 kicks the knight goes back to f6. But then bishop to e5 hits the queen, and you could have just a repetition of moves. If black were to try to take the bishop to get 2 minors for the exchange, the problem is after that variation ends, the bishop at a3 would hang. So that was probably his best, but that's very hard to see. He instead plays a more obvious move, queen to c3, aiming it at g7, threatening an immediate mate. So Tal deals with that by playing f6, blocking that diagonal. Rook a to d1. Again, this pawn is the center of the action. The rook is now aiming at it. Rook f to e8. Tal just completely centralizes his forces, his heavy pieces, down the d and the e files. Rook to d2. This rook defends f2 laterally and allows the other rook to come over to d1 to increase the pressure on the pawn at d3. But now bishop to f5, adding a defender to the pawn with this bishop at f5. The pawn is completely supported, and at this point has grown to really an overpowering state. It is very, very strong. And it is at this moment that Vladimir Saigin plays a very strong move at first sight. He plays the move knight to g5. Now, obviously, the knight cannot be taken because if pawn takes knight, queen takes g7 is mate. Also, he's threatening bishop to d5 check, and that would interfere with the defense of this pawn. And also, he would have to worry about all kinds of stuff with the knight coming to f2, which would create forks. So this is a very creative move from white, but Tal is just a little bit more creative, and he plays this very nice move, knight to e3. Not only does it control this square so there's no check, it hits the rook, it hits the bishop, it really has to be taken. So white takes it, then bishop to e3 check, hits the king as well as the rook at d2, king to h1, bishop takes d2, he's threatening the queen, so white still has no time for bishop to d5 check. He's always just one step ahead with his tactics. Queen takes d2, and in this position, pawn takes knight, actually, it does work. But Tal plays the more aggressive Tal-like move, of course. Rook to e2, hitting the queen and putting that rook on the 7th rank, and now the rook can help escort this pawn forward. The queen goes back to c3, again, keeping black from taking the knight, but he doesn't need to. His final move is the coup de grace in this position. Rook takes g2, giving up the exchange, but that's enough. And here white resigned, and let's see why. After king takes rook, Tal would play d2, threatening to promote to a queen. And white cannot take the bishop because he would just queen. White wouldn't even be able to recapture it. So he could play rook to d1, but then bishop to g4 aims directly at that rook. If knight to f3, the knight is sort of self-pinning, but preventing the bishop from taking the rook, then Tal could play queen to d3, threatening bishop takes knight check. If the queens come off, the pin remains. If white plays rook takes d2, then just bishop takes knight check, removes the defender of the rook, and he would win that way. And if instead he takes with the knight, he just loses the rook straight out. So a better move than knight to f3 might be knight to e4, which hits the queen as well as the pawn. The problem with that move, queen to c6, pinning that knight against the king. And now you still have the same problem with this rook being threatened. If queen to e3, you just take, to defend the knight, then you just take the rook, and that's it. And the final indignity here is that white still can't take the pawn because the knight is pinned and the rook at d8 defends it. So very powerful play from Tal. Interesting to see how just little tactics over and over that just consistently prevent white from doing what he wants as he marched that d-pawn right down the board to victory. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.